So who exactly would bail out Bitcoin, and why did a question like this even appear in a serious political setting after a US lawmaker openly asked Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent whether the government might need to step in if Bitcoin ever needed saving? Because on the surface, it sounds like a reasonable concern, but underneath it reveals how deeply most of us are still trained to think about money, systems as things that must always have an owner or manager and a rescue plan. Hey, Alan here, and welcome to The Breakdown, where we take confusing topics and break them down step by step so they're easier to understand and actually useful. If there's ever a topic you want us to cover or something you want to explain more clearly, leave it in the comments because we build these videos around what you're curious about. And with that being said, let's get back to the video. To understand why the idea of bailing out Bitcoin even enters the conversation at all, you first have to understand what bailouts are actually designed for and why governments have relied on them historically. Because bailouts are not random acts of generosity, and they are not meant to reward failure, but emergency tools created to stop cascading collapses inside tightly coupled centralized systems. If you look back through modern financial history, governments have repeatedly stepped in to rescue banks, insurance companies, auto manufacturers, and major financial institutions during moments of crisis, because those entities were centralized, legally defined, politically connected, and deeply embedded into the economic plumbing in a way that made their failure spread outward rather than stay contained. When a major bank fails, the concern is not sympathy for executives or shareholders, but the fact that deposits can disappear overnight, payrolls can freeze, credit markets can seize up, and fear can spread faster than regulators can respond. Which is why governments step in to protect depositors, stabilize balance sheets, negotiate with management, and inject taxpayer money into legal entities that can actually receive and deploy that money. Every bailout follows the same basic pattern because there is always a recipient at headquarters, a board of directors, a balance sheet, and a clear point of control where the government can say, here is the money, and here are the conditions attached to it. This framework worked not because it was elegant, but because the systems themselves were centralized enough for intervention to actually change the outcome. Now take that entire framework and try to apply it to Bitcoin, and the logic starts to bend in uncomfortable ways. Bitcoin is not a company, it is not a bank, it is not an insurance firm, and it is not a financial institution with a charter, a headquarters, or a leadership team that can be called into Washington for an emergency meeting and asked to explain themselves. There is no Bitcoin CEO to negotiate, with no Bitcoin balance sheet to repair, no Bitcoin depositors to ensure, and no central organization that can accept a wire transfer from the US Treasury, which already makes the idea of a bailout feel strange in the same way it would feel strange to ask who you would bail out if the internet slowed down or if mass started producing inconvenient answers. That is why when Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent responded by saying that the US Treasury has no authority to bail out Bitcoin, he was not dodging the question or offering a clever political answer, but stating a legal and structural reality about how decentralized systems actually work. The Treasury cannot bail out Bitcoin for the same reason it cannot bail out open source software protocols or the laws of physics, because there is no central owner, no controlling entity, and no lever through which authority can be applied. Bitcoin is a decentralized network governed by code and consensus among independent participants spread across the world, where rules are enforced by cryptography incentives and competition rather than by press conferences, regulatory guidance, or emergency legislation passed late on a Sunday night. Its value is discovered on open markets where buyers and sellers voluntarily interact, and its security is maintained by miners who independently choose to commit energy and capital to the network in exchange for rewards, not because they are instructed to do so by a central authority, but because the incentives make sense to them. That last part matters because when people imagine a Bitcoin bailout, they are usually imagining something very different from how the system actually operates. What they are often picturing is the government stepping in to support the price of Bitcoin as if price itself were something that could be stabilized with a policy announcement or a funding facility, but prices are not entities you rescue, because prices are signals that reflect information, fear, optimism, leverage, and time horizons. When Bitcoin's price falls, the network does not panic, the miners do not wait for instructions, and the code does not change its rules, because nothing about a price decline threatens the ability of the system to keep operating. Blocks continue to be produced, transactions continue to settle, difficulty adjusts, and miners who remain profitable continue securing the network, while those who are not adjust or exit, which is exactly how a competitive system is supposed to behave. This is fundamentally different from a failing institution that needs immediate cash just to survive another week. If anything, Bitcoin's volatility is part of its discovery process, not evidence of structural weakness and confusing price movement with system failure, is one of the most common mistakes people make when viewing decentralized systems through a centralized mindset. The mindset is understandable, because for decades we have been conditioned to believe that anything important must have an owner, a manager, and a backstop, and that if something grows large enough, the government will eventually step in to save it. Bitcoin challenges that assumption by existing without permission, without guarantees, and without a safety net, which is deeply uncomfortable for institutions that are used to controlling outcomes through policy intervention. Yet discomfort often shows up as questions about regulation, control, and bailouts, because those are the tools policymakers are familiar with. And when confronted with a system that does not respond to those tools, the instinct is to ask how it could be forced to behave like the systems that came before it. But Bitcoin was deliberately designed to resist that type of intervention, not as an act of rebellion, but as a response to repeated historical failures where centralized control introduced hidden fragility into systems that were supposed to be stable. Bitcoin does not ask to be saved during downturns, because downturns do not threaten its existence, and Bitcoin does not rely on political rescue, because political rescue was never part of its design assumptions. This brings us to the core answer to the original question, and it deserves to be stated clearly without hype or exaggeration. The government cannot bail out Bitcoin, not because it lacks interest, not because it is being restrained, and not because it is waiting for the right moment, but because Bitcoin was built in a way that makes bailouts unnecessary and impossible. There is no lever to pull, no fund to deploy, and no authority to exercise, because Bitcoin does not rely on centralized decision-making to function. That design choice is not a flaw, and it is not an oversight, but the defining feature of the system itself. So the final answer is simple and definitive. No one can bail out Bitcoin because Bitcoin does not need to be bailed out, and the fact that it cannot be rescued by governments is precisely why it exists in the first place, which means the real lesson here is not about Bitcoin at all, but about how deeply we are still conditioned to believe that every system must eventually be saved by someone in charge. And that's the breakdown. If you learned something new, leave a like and subscribe, but more importantly, drop a comment with what we should break down next, since these videos are driven by your requests. And until next time, stay curious and keep learning.